Long before the wars of angels, demons, and mortals, Diablo's history begins with a hidden break in the cosmic order, the creation of Sanctuary. It was not an accident. The renegade angel Inarius and the demon Lilith made that world together, and from it came humanity, a third force neither heaven nor the burning hells could fully control. That is why Lilith matters so much to Diablo's timeline. She is not just another demon in the setting's history. She helped create the world of Sanctuary, and her choices shape nearly everything that follows. From that point on, the struggle is no longer only angels versus demons. It becomes a fight over humanity, the world it inherited, and the violent legacy left by its creators. Before Sanctuary could become a secret refuge, it was born inside a war that heaven and hell have never managed to end. Diablo is shaped by the eternal conflict, the endless struggle between the high heavens and the burning hells. It is not a war with a clean beginning or a final victory. It is the condition the universe lives under, a constant clash that shapes everything around it. Angels and demons are more than enemies here. They are opposing principles, one driven toward order, the other toward corruption and ruin, and neither side has ever erased the other. At the center of Hell's side are the prime evils, Diablo, Mephisto, and Baal. They are not just the strongest demons in the hierarchy. They give Hell its direction and its long memory. Beneath them stand the lesser evils, including Andariel, Duriel, Belial, and Asmodan, each powerful enough to shape events on their own. This matters because the burning hells are not random chaos. They are divided by ambition, but they still share the same purpose, to keep pressure on heaven and keep the conflict alive. The high heavens respond through the angelic hosts and the Angiras Council. Their war against hell does not stay contained in one place. It destroys civilizations, topples regions, and leaves worlds struggling to recover before the next offensive begins. When one side gains ground, the other counters. When one side is forced back, the war does not stop. It shifts and continues under a new shape. That is the backdrop for Sanctuary, and it is also why Sanctuary becomes so important. It introduces something neither side was prepared to fully control. Lilith and Inarius break from their own sides because they are both exhausted by a war without an ending. Inarius, once an angel, sees a future outside heaven's rigid order. Lilith, the daughter of Mephisto, sees the possibility of building something beyond hell's endless appetite for conquest. Their alliance is unusual, but it is also practical. In a universe defined by permanent war, leaving both sides is itself a radical choice. That choice leads to Sanctuary, a hidden world cut off from direct rule by heaven and hell. It is meant to be a refuge, but it is also a challenge to the all balance. If angels and demons can create a world neither side can fully dominate, then the eternal conflict no longer covers everything. Sanctuary is not just a place to hide. It is proof that the war can be interrupted. That is why Sanctuary matters so much in the larger timeline. Heaven and hell are used to treating existence like territory already claimed by their struggle. Sanctuary creates a third space, one built outside that logic. It becomes a threat before anyone fully understands what it is. And once that world exists, the next question is unavoidable. What happens to the beings born there, especially when their blood carries both angelic and demonic roots? That answer begins with the first Nephalem, and with the possibility that Sanctuary may have created a power strong enough to change the war itself. Once Sanctuary exists, the question is whether it can stay hidden. Lilith and Inarius did not create it as a symbol or a political project. They made it as an escape from the war that had consumed heaven and hell for ages. But a world built outside that conflict cannot stay irrelevant for long. Sanctuary is protected only by distance, secrecy, and the hope that its creators can keep it out of sight until the eternal conflict moves on without them. That hope does not hold forever. The children born in Sanctuary are not ordinary mortals. They are Nephalem, descendants of angels and demons, and their earliest generation is far stronger than the humanity that follows. This is the turning point in the timeline, because it shows that Sanctuary was never just a refuge. It was also an uncontrolled experiment. The first Nephalem could wield power that alarmed even the beings who had created them. In a world defined by the struggle between angel and demon, that kind of inheritance is dangerous to everyone. Lilith understands that immediately. She sees the Nephalem not as a failure, but as a possibility. If Sanctuary's children are allowed to grow without restraint, they may become stronger than the armies of heaven and hell combined. Inarius sees the same bloodline very differently. To him, the Nephalem are proof that Sanctuary has drifted too far from the order he wanted to preserve. That split matters because it turns Sanctuary from a shared refuge into a contested inheritance. They are no longer just hiding from the war, they are divided over what their new world should become. The response from the greater powers matters just as much. Heaven does not look at Sanctuary and see a harmless hideout. It sees a world that could upset the balance of creation. Hell sees something similar, though for different reasons. A bloodline that carries both angelic and demonic power is unstable from either side's perspective. If Sanctuary grows into what it was made to be, neither heaven nor hell can assume it will remain passive. The secret may be buried from direct view, but its existence already changes the logic of the war around it. Over time, the Nephalem do not remain as overwhelmingly powerful as the first generation. Their strength fades, and humanity becomes more mortal, more fragile, and easier to ignore. That weakness is part of the long-term outcome of Sanctuary's early crisis. The world survives, but its origins are obscured. Its people inherit life without fully understanding what was once possible for them. Practically, that makes Sanctuary safer. In larger terms, it makes humanity easier to manage, both by its own rulers and by the cosmic forces that might otherwise fear what it could become. It also means later generations no longer remember themselves as heirs to something far greater. That loss of memory is what lets Sanctuary continue in a form the higher powers can tolerate, at least for a time. By the end of this chapter, Sanctuary has settled into a dangerous middle state. It remains hidden from heaven and hell only because its true nature has been buried. The Nephalem proved that humanity could once carry power on a scale that rivaled the beings who made the world. That fact never fully disappears. It sits under the history of Sanctuary and shapes everything that follows. The world survives as a place built on forgotten strength, and that is exactly why it remains vulnerable. Every later crisis begins with the same contradiction, a place made to be left alone, created by beings who could not agree on what freedom was supposed to mean. As Sanctuary settles into history, the next question is no longer whether humanity can survive. It is what happens when survival begins to look like a threat. The earliest Nephalem are still much closer to their angelic and demonic parents than the humans that come later, and that makes them dangerous in a way neither heaven nor hell can accept. They do not answer to angelic rule, and they are not bound to demon rule either. That independence is the real problem. If those first generations remain strong enough, they could become a third force in the conflict, and both sides have every reason to prevent that. That fear shapes the age that follows. The Nephalem do not simply appear after the eternal conflict, they inherit its unresolved tension. They live in the aftermath of rebellion, creation, and compromise, and their existence proves that the old order has already fractured in a lasting way. For heaven, that is a warning that creation can produce something outside strict divine control. For hell, it is even more troubling because the Nephalem are not a population that can be assumed to fall into corruption by default. In practical terms, that gives both sides reason to watch them closely and, eventually, to try to diminish them. Over time, the Nephalem do not stay at their original level of power. Their descendants grow weaker, and the race gradually becomes what the setting later recognizes as humanity. This is not just a biological change, it is a political one too. The more mortal people become, the easier they are to fold into kingdoms, religions, and societies that look ordinary from the outside. A people who no longer remember their own origin are easier to shape and easier to overlook. That serves the forces that want Sanctuary hidden, because a world full of unaware humans does not seem like a world that could affect the balance of the cosmos. This weakening also makes later history possible. The first Nephalem are too powerful to remain a quiet footnote forever, but their descendants are easier to absorb into the background of a developing world. Cities rise, traditions spread, and survival starts to matter more than origin. People begin to define themselves by tribe, faith, land, and memory that reaches only a few generations back. What was once a race marked by extraordinary potential becomes a race marked by vulnerability. In that sense, humanity's decline is not only a loss, it is also what allows Sanctuary to continue without constant interference from the powers that created it. The problem is that the truth never disappears completely. Across Diablo's history, there are repeated attempts to bury what humans once were. Some of that comes from those who fear what a renewed Nephalem bloodline might mean. Some of it comes from people trying to protect Sanctuary from outside attention, and some of it is simple self-preservation. If the angels understood that humanity still carried Nephalem potential, they might decide Sanctuary should be controlled or erased. If the demons fully understood the same thing, they would see humanity as something to corrupt, exploit, or turn into a weapon. That is why suppressing Nephalem power matters so much. It does not just weaken individuals, it changes the long-term shape of the world. Human culture comes to rest on short lives, short memory, and limited expectations. Most people live and die without any idea that their ancestors were something far greater. Early legends blur into myth, and myth hardens into history, and then history becomes something almost no one believes. When that happens, ignorance becomes a kind of protection. Sanctuary is safer in one sense, but also more exposed, because a people who do not know what they are cannot prepare for what they may become again. Even so, the buried inheritance does surface at different points in the series. Later stories keep returning to the same underlying tension. Humanity is not as small as it appears, but by the time those signs emerge, the damage is already done. Sanctuary has spent ages living under the shadow of its own forgetfulness. Its people are less protected than they should be, because they have lost sight of the source of their strength. They are also less visible to the powers above and below, which looks like safety until the next invasion arrives. So the Nephalem Age ends with an uneasy success. Humanity remains, Sanctuary stays hidden. The old bloodlines are diluted enough that the world can go unnoticed for a time, but that peace rests on a buried foundation. The power that once made humanity exceptional has not been destroyed. It has only been pushed underground, where it waits beneath the ordinary history of a world that no longer understands itself. By the time Sanctuary's hidden history has faded into legend, the war behind it is still going on. Heaven and hell keep pressing into the mortal world whenever the balance shifts, a seal weakens, or one of the prime evils finds a path back. That pattern defines the original Diablo era. The first game opens on an older disaster already in motion. Diablo, Mephisto, and Baal had been cast out of the burning hells and trapped in Sanctuary long before the events of the games. In the early lore, that exile is not just background. It explains why demonic influence runs so deep through the world. Cut off from the hells but stuck in a mortal realm, the evils do not wait passively. They corrupt rulers, twist institutions, and leave behind damage that people only recognize once collapse is already close. By the time the story reaches Tristram, the danger is not new. It is the result of years of hidden pressure finally breaking through. That is why Diablo matters so much in the timeline. It is not just one monster beneath one cathedral. It is the moment Sanctuary is forced to confront powers older than any kingdom. Diablo's presence in Tristram shows how exposed the world really is once those buried forces rise again. The old cathedral becomes a channel for corruption, and the people around it have little defense against a threat that has been building for ages. By the time Diablo is faced, the lesson is already clear. Sanctuary is not safe because it is unaware. It is only untouched for a while. Once corruption reaches a settlement, it spreads fast enough that local authority, faith, and memory can fail at the same time. Diablo II expands that crisis into a wider campaign. Here, the prime evils move openly, and their goals are easier to trace. Each major conflict shows the same method. They do not need a clean invasion. They can break Sanctuary through chaos, possession, and mistrust. Mephisto's influence in Kurast, Diablo's growing manifestation, and Baal's assault on the Worldstone all show a world being worn down from the inside. The heroes are not just fighting monsters in separate regions, they are chasing a coordinated return of the three prime evils across multiple fronts, each one exploiting a different weakness in mortal society. The Worldstone is what makes this phase so important to the larger timeline. It had helped suppress humanity's Nephalem heritage. When that structure is damaged and then destroyed, the consequences reach far beyond a single war. The barrier that kept Sanctuary's people weaker is gone. The heroes win a costly victory, and the prime evils are stopped for the moment, but the world they leave behind is more exposed than before. One of the few systems limiting future demonic interference is gone, and the destruction of the Worldstone also opens the possibility that humanity's buried strength could return later on. Every later crisis now begins from a more dangerous baseline. Between Diablo II and Diablo III, that fragility becomes harder to ignore. The Sin War material, especially in novel continuity, shows how the old powers keep reaching into Sanctuary through cults, bloodlines, and long memory. The angels are part of that pressure too. They watch, interfere, and disagree over whether humanity is a threat, a mistake, or something worth preserving. Sanctuary is caught between forces that do not fully trust it, and the moment one side gains an advantage, the balance starts to slip. That wider struggle matters because it explains why later events do not come out of nowhere. The world is already full of buried loyalties, secret orders, and inherited conflict before the next invasion begins. Diablo III turns that instability into full-scale disaster. The game begins with a fresh assault on Sanctuary, but the larger context matters more. Diablo's return is tied to a broader effort to gather demonic power and erase the line between the mortal world and the hells. What makes this era so important is the long cost of everything that came before it. Sanctuary is already wounded, politically fractured, and carrying the consequences of its hidden origins. When the new invasion begins, there is far less strength left than anyone wants to admit. There are still armies, temples, and old names of authority, but none of them are enough to absorb a crisis on this scale without breaking. As the conflict spreads, the world is forced to absorb losses it can barely survive. The attack on New Tristram, the corruption of key figures, rising cult activity, and the collapse of order across the continents all point to the same truth. Sanctuary is not a stable civilization holding back outside invaders. It is a damaged world trying to function while cosmic war keeps spilling into its streets. The angelic and demonic conflicts are no longer distant. They are immediate, and they keep finding ways to use mortal ambition against mortals themselves. In practical terms, that means every major victory comes with a deeper wound. Leaders are lost, trust erodes, and the surviving institutions are left weaker than before. The climax of Diablo III sharpens that point. Diablo's return as the primeval shows how these threats build on earlier wounds and turn old victories into new weaknesses. Even when he is defeated, the victory does not restore balance. It only reveals how much has already been lost. Heaven is strained, hell is fractured, and Sanctuary has been battered by repeated intrusions from both sides. The outcome matters because it does not close the conflict. It leaves all three realms altered, with no clean restoration and no simple return to the old order. That is the turning point leading into the next age. By the end of Diablo III, none of the major powers are in a strong position. Heaven has suffered serious losses. Hell is not unified enough to overwhelm the mortal world. Sanctuary survives, but it survives damaged, shaped by catastrophe after catastrophe. The world that once hid its true nature has now paid for that secrecy many times over, and with both sides weakened, the story is ready for something older and more personal to return. By the time Diablo III ends, the old war is not resolved. It has only shown how little strength Sanctuary has left. That is what makes Lilith's return in Diablo IV feel so dangerous. She is not a new invader coming into a stable world. She is one of Sanctuary's original creators returning to a land already worn down by endless conflict. Lilith matters because she represents a different answer to Sanctuary's purpose. Long before Diablo IV, she and Inarius created the hidden world as a refuge from the eternal conflict. Lilith never saw it as a passive shelter. She believed humanity could be shaped into something strong enough to survive heaven and hell on its own terms. Her return brings that idea back, but in a far harsher form. She does not arrive like a simple conqueror. She arrives like someone convinced the world has been broken too many times by the same cosmic powers, and that only a radical change can save it. That is the central tension around her. Lilith offers liberation, but her version of liberation depends on fear, control, and sacrifice. She speaks directly to human suffering because Sanctuary is full of it. The world has endured demonic corruption, angelic interference, political collapse, and repeated disasters that leave ordinary people desperate for help. Lilith understands that weakness and uses it. She spreads influence by exploiting desperation, presenting herself as a savior because she knows how damaged the world has become. Her return also forces Sanctuary to confront a question that has followed it since its creation. What is humanity meant to be? If the Nephalem legacy at the heart of mankind still matters, then humans are not meant to stay small and dependent forever. But if that power is awakened without restraint, it can become a danger even Sanctuary cannot control. Lilith wants to push humanity toward that buried strength, but not out of mercy. She wants a world that can stand against heaven and hell, and she is willing to terrify or reshape people to get there. That is what makes the conflict so unsettling. Diablo IV is not just another demon invasion, and it is not just another heavenly intervention. It is a struggle over the future of the mortal world itself. Lilith's opponents are not dealing with a threat that can simply be driven away because her ideas are rooted in real wounds. She can point to centuries of heaven and hell treating humanity as disposable, and part of her appeal comes from how often that claim feels true. Sanctuary has been used as a battlefield for so long that her argument lands on already damaged ground. Even people who reject her are still living in the ruins left behind by the powers she condemns. Mephisto's shadow also hangs over this return. The primeval legacy still shapes Sanctuary through corruption, cults, and the constant temptation to trade freedom for power. Lilith's path grows out of that same history. Sanctuary has always been caught between hell's manipulation and heaven's judgment, and Lilith offers herself as a third answer. She does not ask people to trust heaven. She does not ask them to submit to hell. She asks them to accept her, and that makes her dangerous in a different way. But she is still a demon, and Diablo IV never lets that be forgotten. Her goals may sound protective, even practical, but her methods carry the same willingness to consume, sacrifice, and dominate that has always defined the Burning Hells. That is what makes her such a sharp fit for the series. She is not a simple villain, and she is not a simple ally. She is a reminder that in Diablo, power always comes with a demand, and that demand is rarely kind. So Lilith's return pushes the timeline into a new phase. Sanctuary is no longer only recovering from the wars of Diablo III. It is being tested by one of its own creators, someone who knows how to exploit its fear and weakness. Her legacy is active again, and with it comes the possibility that humanity could be remade rather than merely protected. That leaves Sanctuary at a turning point, with the future of the world tied to whether it can survive being saved on someone else's terms. By the time Lilith falls, Diablo's timeline makes one thing clear: Sanctuary is never just a backdrop. It begins as a hidden refuge outside the eternal conflict, but it cannot stay separate from the war between heaven and hell. That is why the order of events matters. Hell rises, heaven answers, and Lilith returns with a plan that puts humanity at the center of everything. Sanctuary is dragged back into the conflict again, and its people are never just bystanders. They inherit the power, fear, and resistance built into the world from the start. In the end, Diablo is not only a story of demons and angels, it is the story of a refuge becoming the battlefield everyone fights over.